Hey everybody, welcome back. In this week's episode at the Red Barn, we are wiring up our Ferrari 360 swapped Porsche 914. Well, maybe not wiring it all the way up, but we're getting to work on the wiring harness. Where's it going to go? How's it going to route? What wires do I need? What features am I going to try to implement? It's all kinds of fun stuff. Hope you enjoy. Wiring time, and I figured it's only appropriate that I wear my Haltech t-shirt when I'm doing this kind of work. The electrical karma gods will smile upon me if I'm wearing my Haltech t-shirt. Okay, so what I've got here is I've got all the wiring harness stuff hooked to the ECU. I've got the software running, and I've started to separate out a bunch of different items. And the reason I pulled this all back, I actually stripped back this nylon wrap, and what you can see is they've already gone ahead. And for instance, here are 5-volt sensor wires. And what they've done is they've already split them out. And you can see that this bundle here reduces down to 1. This bundle here reduces down to 1. And if I were to pull this shielding back even more, you'd see that eventually these two get down to 1 and it goes into a single pin in that connector so that I don't have to do that splicing. But what I'm starting off with is this. If you remember from last time, I went through and I worked up for each of the sensors. I'm looking at the map sensor here. I worked up the wire assignment, okay? And what's really nice about this software is there's a feature right here called an I/O report. And if I click on that button, what it gives me is it shows me all of my wires and what their assigned function is. And in the case of this particular screen right here at the top, it's exactly what I want to start working on. Coolant temperature, manifold temperature, air temperature sensor, fuel pressure, drive-by wire, blah, blah, blah. And so these are all taken care of. And now all I've got to do is I want to go through and group them. And what I'm doing here is, for those of you that may not know, for most of these sensors, engine sensors require a sensor power lead, a sensor ground, and then the sensor signal wire coming from the sensor back to the ECU. So what I've done is I've separated out all those different bundles of wires, and what I'm going to do now is, using my I/O report, I'm going to go through and I'm going to say, okay, let me build out each of these little sub-harnesses. Well, each of these connectors, or each of these sensor wire sets. So I'll grab the appropriate sensor wire, a ground wire, and a sensor power wire. I'll bundle this up and label it, and I'll have it all identified for all of my engine sensors. I'm not going to trim anything to length. Obviously, I don't know what the routing's going to be. Anyway, I'm going to first go after getting all my sensors identified. I need to get this whole assembly into the car so I can start figuring out routing. And so what I've gone after here is I've pulled back this cover, this nylon sheathing stuff, and trying to determine what's causing, like what wires do I need to mess with to get these loops between these individual main connector branches to pull back closer to the ECU. And what it looks like is the only thing that's joining them that I need to worry about is the CAN wires. And these pink and reds and these blacks are the two main things that are causing these loops to be pushed all the way out to here. So what I've done, as I mentioned, is I'm just pulling this back. And for instance, this one looks like if I pull the actual CAN wire, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see that this thing's connected in to the harness here, but these two cables could be pulled out and I won't have to have it all going back out this way. So I think what I'm going to do is de-pin this connector, pull the wires out of this harness cover, and just have this as a separate component that's outside of this. So I'm going to de-pin this Deutsch connector, and here's how that works. So if you look down in there, it may be a little bit hard to see, but there's a little orange locking piece So I'm just going to use the old needle nose pliers and grab a hold of that carefully and pull it out. And that pulls the locking wedge out. And with that out and carefully set aside, I use the Deutsch tool, which is in some cases a fancy little notched end, and the other end is essentially just a straight blade screwdriver. And what you do is, again, it's going to be impossible to see down in there without any lighting, but there are little tabs. I'm going to pry these out of the way carefully and just free the wires up. And we've got this connector removed. And now what I can do is pull this out of here. To get this wire out of this loom, I'm going to have to de-pin the other end of this from the actual main connector. These are amp super seal connectors, and the way that de-pinning works on these is there's just this locking mechanism here, and if I push it up, it basically unclips. You can see these are now proud of the surface. All these pins are now free to be pulled out. So there's that. And now, if I carefully pull this through, I have just removed that part of the loop from being a problem. And now I'll repin it back into its connector. Here's my blue can wire. It's in pin 22, position 22, and the white wire that I pulled out is in position 21. And here I can see 18, 19, 20, 21 is the white one. 22 is the blue one. And then with those in the proper place, you just push the lock down, and that's now depinned or repinned. And now this thing, this loop is now able to be either, shortened, changed. At the very least, I can move it down in the car. So there we go. One little update. And now let's repin this Deutsch connector. Let's just verify it's CAN 2. It's CAN 2 coming out of position C. So I go over here to position C. I find CAN 2. And I look at the way they want it done. And it's reading clockwise from the 4th position, or from the 1st position. It's pink and red, black, white, blue. So if I orient the connector, it's pink and red in position 1, black in position 2, and this is a game of, I try to get them all kind of started and then push them all in at the same time. Or white in position 3 if we're counting in sequence, and blue in position 4. Again, hard to see, but I can see that they're all in position and they've all clicked into the little clip has grabbed them. And then I go back to my little wedge clip, paying attention to the orientation of the wedge, which is up and down. And it pushes in there, and there's a repin Deutsch connector. So you can see how easy it is to depin and repin these. And now I've got my connector back in place. The CAN cable is in the same place because of its position in the main AMP connector, but my loop is now free. Okay, then after a bit more of the same, you can see I've brought the loops back to here, which is going to be just about perfect for under the seat. I think now I'm going to put this thing in the car and start working out how I want to deal with the pass-throughs of the firewall and all that, and then I think that's kind of when the real work starts. So into the car it goes. Okay, so this looks quite daunting, but it is a process. And so what I'm doing is I'm just trying to get everything sort of organized to figure out how I want to do this. And yeah, so these are all the engine sensors that were previously nice and bundled. And what I realized was I want to figure out exactly which one goes to which side. So I unwound them, and I'm going to go back and regroup them, but I'm going to do it in the context of being in the car. So yeah, I'm going to not film any of this because it's tedious and not very exciting to watch. So when you see it again, it should be a little bit better organized, and I'll have a much better idea of exactly where I want all this stuff to go. So back in a little while. All right, so I grouped all the sensors and everything and shifted back these loops and all this great stuff and stuck this back in the car just to get a feel for how things might fit. And I realized that I don't want to deal with these loops at all, and that based on how I want to organize the wiring, that you end up with, as you, those of you that have done this in the past maybe know, you end up with wires that are coming out one side of the harness, you know, the pre-done harness, you know, and they're twisted around inside there. So I'm going to start all the way over again and just strip all that sheathing off, separate the wires exactly how I need them, and then I'll have complete freedom to route this stuff wherever I want, and I'll be happier with that. Without going into all the detail, I removed all the sheathing from all these main branches. And as a first step, what I'm doing is reorganizing, or just organizing, all of the groupings of wires in each of these connectors so that I can simply make this, you know, as I assemble all of the sensors that I need and all the wiring for all that stuff, I can pull from each group exactly how I want it and route it exactly how I want it without worrying about how far out that branch is and all this other stuff. So this is what I did in the LS car too, and I'm going to resheath all this stuff anyway, so it's really not that big a deal. Don't worry about it. I'm also going to end up with what are called back shelves on here, so I can boot this with a Raychem boot, and you'll see that when we get to it. It's just a way tidier way of getting stress relief for all these wires as they enter the connector, etc. And then here's one for the tool whores. Because I want, you can see these are nicely labeled, and I want to do a temporary labeling job as I'm regrouping these wires. So you can see I've started that here. These are the digital pulsed output groupings from connector A, and the tool I use to do that is this Dymo labeler. And these are really cool because you can do things like print labels, as you can imagine, but later on in the project you'll see that this is heat shrink tubing. So when I finalize the harness, I'll heat shrink, you know, I'll label, you know, whatever it is, air, you know, coolant temperature sensor, CTS, whatever the abbreviation, whatever I want it to say, and then that'll get slid over the final sheathing and heat shrunk down, and then a piece of clear heat shrink tubing goes over that. So you have this really nice, tidy, very professional looking harness. And it, you know, this is as simple as this looks, right? It is as simple as it looks. This with the one I just did earlier. So what I want to do is I want to be able to fold this thing over on itself. So I'm going to go space, 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 and I'm going to call it the half bridge output. And I'm going to go space, 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 and I'm going to go half bridge output, and then space, 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 and print it. And out it comes from the top. And then this is the cutter here, and I'm going to cut that. And now I've got my half bridge output label. And I'll put you on the stand here. And I've got a nice label on my half bridge. And it's all labeled, everything's labeled on the wiring diagram, so I don't have to worry too much about chasing this stuff down. But it's just nice to be able to glance at it and say, ah, yes, that's that. So a bunch of stuff to work out, but this is the fun part, and it's just, it's actually quite, you know, it's kind of a Zen thing. You just get into the zone of pulling wires out and labeling them and, you know, thinking about how it's going to all work out in the end. So I actually kind of enjoy this part, but I'm just going to keep going after this until I get the entire harness down to kind of this look and feel. And you can see once it's pulled down like this, it's not nearly as intimidating. So now I can go back to my mapping pull my sensor wires, grounds, power, all that other good stuff. These are the big deal crank, cam, knock sensor wires. But now I don't have to worry about where those splits are. Next step is I got to determine how many wires I need to pass from the ECU through the firewall into the engine. And I'm not going to worry about what I'm calling the rear chassis elements, meaning the taillights, turn signals, and all that stuff. I'm going to deal with all of that non-engine wiring as a separate pass-through in a different location in the firewall. So right now it's just ECU to engine. And what I'm doing is just working up a listing of all my sensors and the number of wires each one requires. And I'm getting myself upwards of 87 wires. And that was a big number. When I looked at it, I'm like, 87 wires, how did I do that? Well, remember, this motor's got 2 of everything, meaning I've got 2 drive-by-wire throttles, and each one of those is 6 wires. I've got 8 injectors, 8 coils. I've got 2 O2 sensors. Each one of those is 6 wires, and so it adds up really quickly. What this is doing for me, though, is I now get to go figure out physically how I want to route the wires, meaning am I going to run through one location and split the harness on the engine side, or am I going to go through splitting the harness inside the car and having like a left and right pass through. So yeah, I got to go figure all this stuff out. And then this also includes future state stuff. So things like if I add air conditioning, I want to make sure there's a wire set there for that. I'm thinking about running with an with a digital dash at first, because I think they're cool, but I may want to swap that out. Aesthetically, it may be sort of a better fit for the build if it had analog gauges. But if I do that, I have to have certain sensors that feed the ECU, and like coolant temperature, for instance, to drive the fans. But I would also need a gauge coolant temperature sensor. And as I understand it, you can't just have one sensor and split to 2 wires. It messes up either both or one of the gauges. So I'm planning ahead and potentially having 2 coolant temperature sensors in there, 2 oil pressure sensors, etc. So I'm building those wires into the system because I don't know what I don't know yet. Anyway, so now go figure out physical layout and look at what my options are for connectors, and that's always pretty cool. And I'll show you all that stuff as I get to it. And now I want to plan out the harness routing as it gets onto the engine and needs to get to all the sensors. And here's a big shout out to High Performance Academy, HPA. They are an organization that offers a ton of online courses. And prior to me doing the LS build, I had never done any wiring at all. And I found them and took all their wiring courses and a bunch of other stuff, watched all the webinars that they put up about wiring, and had a very successful result my first go with that LS harness. And so now I'm going to do the same thing with this build. And the first thing I'm going to do is make up a rope-based wiring loom so I can get distances, and essentially this serves as a stand-in for the harness. And you can route, try different routings, see what you like, what works. And at the end, this will be the harness, or a mock-up of the harness, with all the different branching points coming off of it, with everything labeled, going to each of the sensors, the coils, the injectors, all that good stuff. And then I have all the measurement lengths I need from the engine side of things to, let's just say, the firewall, where the bulkhead connectors are going to be. And then I can build up the engine side of the harness. And then I'll have to work out, obviously the ECU to that same bulkhead connector on the firewall. But now I'm just going to go ahead and start laying in, this is, you can see, this stuff sort of bends about the same as what a wiring harness would do. So it gives you a really good approximation of where you can route the wires and how things are going to fit and end up looking. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. Well, I got started, but I did not make much progress. Martin stopped by with a buddy, and we got to talking about some other stuff, and time got away from me. But I did get a few things done. I got the ignition lines done on this side, that candy cane rope that you see coming down there is sort of like the main trunk of the engine harness, and it's going to come down. You're seeing that's the crank position sensor, then it drops down to the starter and the oil temp sensor. Got the oil pressure, coolant temp, and then that white run you're seeing over there is for the first of the O2 sensors. So it's just a bit tedious, but what it does is it gives me a really good opportunity to kind of be like, well, hold on a second, that's not going to work. And it's things like, where is this actually going to run? And what you can see is, if you can see, Ferrari actually has these little P-clamps that I can use to suspend the harness tucked up against the intake runners, which is kind of cool. So I got those on both sides, but it's just the necessary to get this wiring figured out. So I'm just going to keep chipping away at this, but I am going to call it for this episode. And as always, thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, and everybody take care. We'll talk to you all again real soon. Bye-bye.